Um, so I just want to say welcome to everybody and thank you so much for being here this afternoon. This presentation, this event is part of a larger sort of package of events associated with a grant from Texas Humanities or Humanities Texas. What's kind of interesting and fun and a challenge is that all of our plans related to this grant were made right prior to COVID. So we literally sent in our grant application right before spring break. And then, of course, everything happened. And so we've sort of rebooted and recalibrated and moved things to a virtual format. And I'm just delighted that that's working. And again, that we can still do meaningful work. Something that I wanted for our music students and our fine arts students is an interdisciplinary approach to musical theater origins. So if you work with music students and particularly voice students who love musical theater, a lot of them are in love with contemporary styles. So think Hamilton for a minute, or Mean Girls, or any number of Broadway musicals that are current. And what's interesting is lots of folks think that these contemporary sounds and contemporary sort of arcs sort of spontaneously generated with this generation. And the truth is there are layers to sort of unpack and uncover. And so what this grant really was intended to do is show folks that there's quite a history and there's quite a tradition that contemporary musical theater is rooted in. Gilbert and Sullivan are kind of fascinating as song composers, as musical theater composers and librettists, because the Victorian era was such a time of modesty and of understatement in many ways and reserve. And Gilbert and Sullivan is sort of the opposite of all of that. So it's an interesting time period and an interesting tradition and so relevant to current day. So that's a little bit of the background and sort of the reason why. I have to say out loud right now how grateful that we are to Humanities Texas for their consideration of our request, for their support of this project, and that they saw value in this kind of interdisciplinary study, and their support of our students, as well as being able to present these events to the larger community. So I'm recording right now what we're doing in this presentation, and I will post this presentation for a larger audience, a community audience, very soon in the future. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bo Rollins and say thank you to you. Thank you so much for being willing to just collaborate and share your thoughts on Gilbert and Sullivan, but also just theater tradition and where that comes from. And just know how much you're appreciated. Thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance to do this. So, all right, am I ready to go?
You are ready.
All right. So first of all, welcome to all my colleagues and students. As you know, I am very, very uncomfortable not being able to be face-to-face with people. I know some people have stage fright. I'm only frightened when I'm not on stage. And so this is a little strange. So, but what I'd like everyone to do is please, and I'll try to intermittently pause, so that if you do have questions or wish to respond, I'd like this to be very interactive. So once I get started, I'm going to do, now I noticed your flyer said that this was going to be an entertaining look at Gilbert. How about this as a look at entertainment? Whether or not I'm going to be entertaining or not, I'm not sure. So here's what I want to try to do is I want to get to Gilbert and Sullivan and then project a little bit past them. As you see my title, subtitle, From Gilbert and Sullivan to the Goon Show to Monty Python, and maybe take a look at not only the roots of Gilbert and Sullivan, but also some of the branches that flow from them. And then I know that Alice and you are going to pick that up as well. So let me do this as I try to move through this, oh, there we go, slideshow. What I want to try to give you is a brief history of both Georgian and Victorian drama in 3 acts. Gilbert and Sullivan typically broke theirs up into 2 acts. The classical structure that most of us are familiar with is in 5 acts, but I think I could do this in 3 acts because we don't have a lot of time this afternoon. So the beginning, Act 1, is a very, very long act, which comprises what we call, and what I think some historians still refer to as the long 17th century, or the long 18th century, which begins in 1660 and ends technically, I think the historians can correct me, in 1832 with the Act of Reform. But in terms of the theaters, let me just set this up a bit. And actually to go back, I guess we'd call this the prologue. In 1642, when the Puritans effectively took power, through a series of actions and actually acts of parliament, they closed the theaters, or they closed most of the theatrical companies. And most of the people who were involved in the theater business, fled to Paris, along with the son of the king who would shortly be executed in 1649. In 1660, when Charles is restored, the throne is restored to Charles, Charles chartered two theatrical companies, the King's Company and the Duke's Company. Charles himself was a strong supporter of the theater, in part because he liked the art, but beginning in 1660, most of you know this, the English dramatic tradition made a very strange decision, which is beginning in 1660, they began to have the female roles actually played by females. And so this was new on the English stage. And frankly, Charles liked the theater in part because he used it as a farm system for his mistresses. So Charles charters these 2 companies. And for most of this long 18th century, those are the 2 chartered companies that are licensed first by the Master of Revels and then by the Lord Chamberlain to perform drama. And so even when we get to the beginning of what we would call the 19th century, that old system, the patent system, was still in place, meaning only these 2 companies were authorized to put on what they would have considered traditional drama. Some of it was Shakespeare, not all of it was Shakespeare. There were other older dramatists that they also had in repertoire, but it was only those 2 companies, and they were performing them in 2 very old theaters. This is a picture of the Covent Garden Theater. It's a reproduction of what we think it looked like, its internal structure looked like at the beginning of the 19th century. I think this is actually supposed to be the performance of an opera, not a play. And then this is Drury Lane Theater. Again, you'll notice as I kind of go back and forth between the 2, very similar in structure. The architecture of the stage is traditional. It is a bit more, one of the things to notice, though, is particularly here at Drury Lane, you'll notice that I'm pointing at it as though you can see me, I'm sorry. You can see that there are actually boxes on the stage. In the 17th century, in the Restoration period, you could actually buy a ticket to sit on stage while the play was being performed, which led in terms of a lot of comedies that a comedy might be making fun of a character who was actually sitting on the stage for that performance, which was pretty cool. And we note that the costumers would sometimes whip something together to mock the costume or the dress that was worn by the object of satire. But at any rate, these 2 patent companies were the only ones authorized to put on traditional drama. But beginning in the early part of that century, they began to build other venues. Now, most of these you'll recognize, I'll try to put all of them up here, as the theaters that would ultimately become what is even now London's West End. They were issued what were called Berletta licenses. I think the Italian is little joke. And so what they allowed them to do was put on smaller, and they at least told the Lord Chamberlain that these were entirely and exclusively musical. So they were kind of like music halls, and so these were licensed. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of unlicensed productions going on everywhere. A lot of those were quickly closed when they found them. But these venues, a couple of things about them. First of all, they were usually smaller and more intimate, and they stayed open longer. So it looks like, and actually a woman in Jackie Bratton, scholar, has done a lot of work on the Adelphi Theater, was originally called the Sans Pareil Theater. Jane Scott, one of the most important women in the theater community early in the 19th century, she was not only the manager of that theater, she also apparently wrote some 50 plays, and some editors are still working on that body of work. But they stayed open longer. Typically, they stayed open at least a couple of hours, and this is really important, after last orders in the pubs. And so you got a lot of people who would come for the early parts of the performances, but you got an even larger audience later in the evening. It also meant that the performance space was not quiet at all. We suspect that even if we go further back to Shakespeare, that was not a quiet theater the way that we would go to the Alley Theater on opening night and we'd all be quiet and be nice. They weren't quiet and they weren't nice. And what that led to was a change in the way they had to perform. It meant that they had to be louder. It meant that the music really did become very important. And it also influenced the acting style as well as the content. So there's going to be much greater physical expression. I'm trying to do it now, physical expression, gestures, all of which are certainly much more suited to music, to dancing, and to comedy. So most of these were comic performances, not exclusively, but most of them were. So what ended up happening is, just as a matter of the law, was that plays, most of them histories or tragedies, are being performed at the two large theaters, and the comedies are being put in these newer, smaller venues. Now, Parliament ultimately tried to change that. They passed what was called the Theaters Act in 1843, which allowed any theater to put on traditional drama. Now, you mentioned earlier this concern for morality. And it seems to have been at least part of the motivation that what they wanted to do was to get some of these theaters who were really wild and raucous places to put on these more traditional, presumably more moralistic and upright and virtuous plays. But that's not at all what happened. What ended up happening was that even those older theaters, one of them had burned down in 1809, I don't remember which one, but even the older, bigger theater companies actually began to put on more of these kinds of performances. So they really circumvented what Parliament had intended, which is to make all theater much more morally upright and circumspect. And it just led to the proliferation of these kinds of things. Okay, I'm going to stop here for just a minute. Any questions so far? Okay, so now that leads us, very short, Act 2, to Act 3, that is comic opera, which did not begin with Gilbert and Sullivan, but they really became pretty quickly the two biggest names, in the same way that Elizabethan drama didn't begin with Shakespeare, but he becomes the biggest name. Gilbert and Sullivan become the biggest names in this new musical comic environment. They collaborated beginning in 1871 on 14, it should be 14 performances. I can't count. We have a math professor here. I think 14 performances. Beginning with a work called Thespis. Gilbert, as Lisa mentioned, was the librettist. The librettist is just, if I've got students there, it just means the person who wrote the words, while Sullivan was the person who wrote the music. I got to tell you a little story. Several years ago, I had to call my pastor aside during a sermon. He made a tremendous error. He mentioned from the pulpit, he mentioned a term in theology. And what he said from the pulpit was most of theology is simply assigning a very smart sounding word to a concept that almost everybody can easily understand. And so I had to call him aside and suggest that not only had he given away theology, but he gave up the game in all of academia. And so I was a little concerned about that. But Gilbert is the librettist or the librist, sorry, the person who wrote the words. It's a great story about how they collaborated. I don't know whether Lisa's going to talk a little bit about that, the way the words and the music come together, which really for me, I focus exclusively on words, and how music is incorporated seems to be a little bit of magic to me. But I'm going to look exclusively at the text of one of these performances. The performance that I'm going to talk about actually was performed, actually it opened in April of 1881. But the popularity of Gilbert and Sullivan was so great that the theater company director, a guy named Richard O'Doyley Cart, built the Savoy Theater simply in order to stage these performances. So sometimes if you're doing research, you find them referred to as Savoy operas because they were performed beginning in 1881 at the Savoy. A number of you may have attended performances. That's the same Savoy Theater that still exists. It was damaged extensively by fire in 1990, but it's at the same spot. A few years ago, I got to see a performance of Richard III at the Savoy. A couple of other noteworthy things about it. It was the first indoor theater. It was the first theater whose lights were electric. And that made some difference to the performance. Okay, so about this, I wanted to take a look, a bit of a look at simply one of their performances. And this is again a performance that premiered in April of 1881 called Patience or Bunthorne's Bride. It is a satire on a couple of poetic movements. Now, this is one that is not frequently staged today. And in part, it's because, like so many other things in the 19th century, and certainly going back to my period, the 17th century, that in order to get the jokes, you have to be current on either the politics or the poetics. You have to know what the target is that they're making fun of. And so I want to do a little bit of that background. But again, you were promised entertainment, and so I can't do too much of that. So by and large, it is a satire on a couple of poetic movements, and I want to talk a little bit about them. This is a reproduction, and the picture is no good, and I apologize that I couldn't get a better picture. This is actually the playbill from the original performance. And what I want you to note is the design of the graphics and the color of the ink, because green was important. Gilbert himself designed not only the layout of this program, but he also designed the costumes that the female characters were supposed to wear. Because all of that, the design, the color, was also meant to mock both the pre-Raphaelites and the aesthetic movement. So let me talk a little bit about the pre-Raphaelites. The pre-Raphaelites were originally a group of painters, that is, graphic artists, who took the name Pre-Raphaelites. They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood because they wanted to reject the standard British style of painting common in the 19th century. So in part, they're deliberately rejecting Victorian values and standards and said that they were going back to the style of painting that was common before the Renaissance painter Raphael. So they're the pre-Raphaelites. But most of them, and what you're seeing on screen now is, I suppose, the most famous of these paintings. I think if you Google Raphaelite painting, you're going to see this first and foremost painting by Edward Burne-Jones called The Golden Stairs. What you'll see here, a couple of things. The stylized figures are fairly common to their paintings. And one of the noteworthy things about them, again, I am no art historian, but one of the real differences here is that by the middle of the 19th century, chemistry had begun to be able to produce new paint colors that didn't appear in nature. And so even though they said they were pre-Raphaelite, they were deliberately in some ways re-invoking a kind of medievalism, at least as they understood it. They're using very new sorts of style and paint color. One other one, just to show you here, maybe equally famous, Behold the Handmaiden of the Lord, Dante Rossetti. If you compare this, those of you who are familiar with it, to any Renaissance or medieval paintings of the Annunciation, this one is quite different in a number of ways. And it's already 3:22, so I don't have time to talk about that. So I'm going to move on. So in the plot of this play, very briefly, there are two poets, Reginald Bunthorne, who is described in the cast list as a fleshly poet, who is meant to satirize the aesthetes, chiefly Dante Rossetti and another poet named A.C. Swinburne. If I had time, I would talk a little bit about Swinburne. But Dante Rossetti is a very important figure. He's going to come up again in just a minute. And a moralistic, what we would call a Victorian writer named Robert Buchanan, had referred to this school of poetry as the fleshly school of poetry. So clearly Gilbert wants us to see him as one of those guys. They were connected, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. The aesthetes were connected to the pre-Raphaelites through Rossetti himself. Now, so Dante Rossetti, very briefly. This is a painting of his, which was accompanied several years later by a long narrative poem. The title of both is called The Blessed Damosel, or Damsel, a deliberate archaism, as you see in a lot of his poetry. Again, pre-Raphaelite, we're going back to an early English stage of not only of painting, but also of literary production. Rossetti imagined this as really, this he said was the follow-up or a sequel to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. But this would have been from the perspective of Lenore. We don't have time to read this poem. I hope you do. But this is actually the beloved there is looking down from heaven on her lover at the bottom of the picture. So this is the Raven, as it were, but from the perspective of Lenore. Now, notice all of the flowers, all of the languid poses in these paintings, and that is primarily what's being satirized here. Now, one other figure is important to talk about in relation to this play, and that's the figure of Oscar Wilde. Almost everybody says or believed at one point that this character, Bunthorne, was modeled on Oscar Wilde. However, it turns out that's exactly backwards, because D'Oyly Carte, who was the producer of, actually is the one who paid for Oscar Wilde to go on his American tour. And effectively, what he wanted Wilde to do was adopt the persona of the character in the performance. And so when we look at Wilde effectively took on some of the characteristics of that character as part of his own personal affectations from that point on. Couple of other really strange things about it. The effeminacy associated with Wilde, and as we're going to have to take a look here, this character Reginald Bunthorne was not at the time taken as a marker or markers for homosexuality. The poets in this play, and there are two of them, Bunthorne and Grosvenor, are deliberately affecting feminine behaviors, but they're doing so in order to gain access to women. So their purpose is it's not an affectation designed to signal effeminacy as it's related later in the 19th century with homosexuality. They are used as a strategy, but their strategy is to get to the women. Okay, and again, I am so sorry this has taken so long. So I want to focus on two poems that Gilbert puts into this play. One is in Act 1, and it's delivered by Reginald Bunthorne. The second is in Act 2, and it's delivered by Archibald Grosvenor. Now, the setup for this poem is that Bunthorne is being followed around by 20 maidens who, because of his affectations and his poetry, are all attracted to him. So he strikes this deliberate, mocking, over-the-top pose of the troubled poet who is dealing with all of these internal emotional struggles. And he writes this poem. The title of it is Hollow, Hollow, Hollow. And he tells Patience, who is actually the maiden who is the object of his affection, do you know what it means to be hollow? And her response, she's a milkmaid, is very straightforward. She goes, no, I'm not hollow, I have eaten. And so what we this poem, it is clearly a deliberate mocking parody of a poem written by either Rossetti or A.C. Swinburne. What time the poet hath hymned the writhing maid, lithe-limbed, quivering on Erymanthine asphodel. How can he paint her woes, knowing, as well he knows, that all can be set right with calomel? When from the poet's plinth the amorous colecanth yearns for the aloe, faint with rapturous thrills, how can he hymn their throes, knowing, as he well knows, that they are only uncompounded pills? Is it, and can it be, nature hath this decree, nothing poetic in the world shall dwell? Or that in all her works something poetic lurks, even in colocynth and calomel? I cannot tell. Now, the joke buried in this poem is that all of these things are really references to laxatives that they used in the 19th century. And so the running joke about being hollow, and he's hollow because he's taken laxatives. And so there is already this connection of his artistic production with, well, excrement. And that's part of the joke that informs that poem. Now, his counterpart, Archibald Grosvenor, is an idyllic poet. And some of you may know Tennyson at the time was poet laureate. He had made famous his version of the Tales of King Arthur called Idylls of the King, which was a kind of Victorianizing of the Arthurian legends. And so in the second act, he is going to present one of his poems. He says, in contrast to the deep thinking of, Bunthorne, He says to appreciate it, his poem, it is not necessary to think of anything at all. And so Angela, one of the maidens, says, let us think of nothing at all. And then he gives us his poem. Gentle Jane was good as gold. She always did as she was told. She never spoke when her mouth was full, or caught blue bottles their legs to pull, or spilt plum jam on her nice new frock, or put white mice in the 8-day clock, or vivisected her last new doll, or fostered a passion for alcohol. And when she grew up, excuse me, she was given in marriage to a first-class earl who keeps his carriage. So a number of things about the poem. Please notice structurally how simple it is. It's all in-stopped. The rhyme is very simple. It's very metrical. It almost sounds like a nursery rhyme. It has a moralistic style, and it has a moralistic message. Be a good girl, and you'll get married, and everything will be good. So here, Gilbert is making fun not only of sort of the cutting edge avant-garde poetry, but he's also making fun of the more staid, traditional Victorian poetry. Now, the ending, which is important because I want to talk a little bit about endings. At the end of the play, the girl that they're both interested in, Grosvenor actually gets her. She agrees to become his wife. Bunthorne is ultimately left with no one. And he is only one of 2 leads in any Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera that doesn't end up paired up at the end with someone at least. Those of you who know, I suppose, the more mainstream, the HMS Pinafore, the Pirates of Penzance, I think even in the Gondoliers, everybody gets paired up at the end. Bunthorne does not. The only other one is a sorcerer, Wells and the Sorcerer. And at least most critical opinions suggest that this is Gilbert sort of offering final judgment directly on the aesthetes, in a sense, affirming the greater value of traditional Victorian morality, or at least Victorian moral poetry. All right. So how do we connect all of this to the modern world, or the postmodern world? So I don't have time to develop any of this fully. And some of you may know about a BBC radio show premiered in 1951 called The Show. A couple of figures might be familiar to you. The biggest name in this comedy troupe was Peter Sellers, who starred in the Pink Panther movies, in Dr. Strangelove. He, as he did in Dr. Strangelove, played a number of characters in these radio dramas. The other big name, and in fact the chief writer of the show, was a guy named Spike Milligan. The last big, I suppose, role that he had, if any of you remember the Raquel Welch Three Musketeers, if you think back to, he plays her husband. He's a very, very old man, and he's married to Raquel Welch. That's Spike Milligan. But very briefly, theirs is a kind of, post-World War II, take on modern British or English life, but ultimately, I would argue that it's reaffirming much of that. Now, but we need to move on, because I wanted to leave some time for presentations. I'm trying to figure out how to move to my next slide. How do I move to my next slide? It's not going. Oh, there. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Okay. So Monty Python. I don't need to, I suppose, talk about Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Some of you even now are clapping coconuts together or reciting some of the lines, coconuts in Mercia, or it's just a flesh wound. Now, what do they owe to Gilbert and Sullivan? Well, just a few things. First of all, in some ways, over-the-top absurdity. We certainly see that in a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan like comic opera. Wilde himself, influenced by Gilbert and Sullivan in the importance of being earnest. We see a lot of over-the-top absurdity, certainly mockery and satire. Now, I didn't have time to develop this, and so I apologize. But by and large, Gilbert and Sullivan's satire is really Horatian satire. It's pretty gentle. It doesn't really overturn the apple cart. It might make fun of the quality of the apples, but it's pretty mild. Monty Python is a little more brutal, maybe not much more. Certainly meta-narrative. There's a great line in, I think it's the Pirates of Penzance, where doesn't the Pirate King, when a musical number is starting, he observes, this sounds like the same music to the last scene. And so, of course, you get this meta-narrative, this commentary on the narrative running through Monty Python all the way to the end. Very famous final scene where King Arthur, on the eve of battle, is arrested by the police. The police arrest him and Sir Bedivere and insist that they stop filming, which I guess that's a little more contemporary than we wanted to be, right? There's the police telling us to stop filming. I guess what would have been a medieval protest. Okay, sorry, I rushed through that. The end. Does anybody have any questions or responses to this thing, whatever I've just done? Anyone still awake?
So I'm just curious, how many people have seen some Gilbert and Sullivan or are familiar with Gilbert and Sullivan? How many folks?
Oh, okay.
Cool. Well, there are quite a few. Awesome. Awesome. No.
No. Yeah. Now, one thing that I did have, and I don't know whether I could get this to work, they show up a lot in popular culture now. Mm. And I've actually got a couple of clips, unless there are questions, I could attempt to show them.
Oh, cool.
One of them is at the end of a Simpsons episode. The other one is an Animaniacs intro.
Okay, awesome. Do it. Let's see them.
Let me see if I can get this to work.
So while you're doing that, I'll just say, in terms of the music of Gilbert and Sullivan, and there will be a future event where we explore the music, quite frankly, but just a word about that. So Gilbert and Sullivan kind of make fun of the formulaic nature that sometimes musical theater, and at that time opera, could have. And in particular, they're making fun of or having fun with 19th century bel canto opera, which is kind of its own unique animal. So opera in England is an interesting phenomenon because opera really developed early on, but then took about a 400-year hiatus. Handel is one of the most famous English, even though he's cosmopolitan and has other connections too, other national connections too, but he did have an English connection and period of time in his own writing. And a lot of what Gilbert and Sullivan do references sort of Handelian formulas, if you will. So all that to say, Gilbert and Sullivan musically, they're making fun of opera. They are themselves referencing bel canto and earlier forms of opera. And it's all just designed to be a lot of absurd fun. How about that as a summary statement?
Cool. So here's just a little clip. Some of you may know that Sideshow Bob is the avowed enemy of Bart Simpson. And this is actually an episode that is a riff on the movie Cape Fear. But this is the end of it where Sideshow Bob, voiced by Kelsey Grammer, has tracked Bart down to the boat where they had been living. And then Bart has a special request of him. Oh, hold on. We'll get past this.
Bar is a phenomenal workout.
And disembowel him. No, I don't like that bowel in there. Got him. Ah, the Mojust. Ah, let me cook your brownie while it's still hot.
Dad, I'm kind of edgy right now.
I'm skipping this. There we go.
Hello, Bart.
Mom! Dad!
Your family. Now.
Oh no! Dad's been drugged!
No, he hasn't. Well, Bart, any last requests?
Well, there's one, but... Nah.
No, go on.
Well, you have such a beautiful voice.
Guilty as charged.
Uh-huh. Anyway, I was wondering if you could sing the entire score of the HMS Pinafore.
Very well, Bart. I shall send you to heaven before I send you to hell. And 2 and 3, and we sail the ocean blue, and our saucy ships of beauty. We are sober men and true, and attentive to our duty. Oh, poor little buttercup, poor little buttercup, though I could never tell lies. Whatever, hardly ever say see. For he himself has said it, and it's clearly to his credit that he is an Englishman. He remains an Englishman.
Sorry about that. I guess you couldn't see it. Without the visual, so I'm sorry. Could you hear that? Okay, you could hear the. I'm sorry. Yeah, I had intended. I didn't know if that would work or not, and the answer is no. So, in any event, you do see if you're familiar with the film Chariots of Fire, there are a number of scenes in Chariots of Fire where there are references to a number of Gilbert and Sullivan live novels. So, sorry about that. So now I'm actually finished. So. Any questions?
Bo, I saw a question in the chat. It says, can you flesh out, no pun intended, the whole theme of the fleshly school of poetry? Is this basically Buchanan's way of expressing a lack of morality or promiscuity?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, to that. His primarily the difference was that the pre-Raphaelites first, and then the aesthetes, the aesthetic movement, which comes after, which is primarily Swinburne. Dante is important because he kind of spans that whole period. Yes, they are concerned about the physical. Swinburne, A.C. Swinburne has a poem called Dolores. And it's a kind of contemplation of a religious figure, Dolores, which means Our Lady of Sorrow. But Swinburne's poem essentially transfers its meaning to suggest that Dolores means Our Lady of Pain. And really, he's celebrating kind of how do I put this delicately in an open session? His desire to experience physical pain as part of a romantic encounter. So yes, very much the fleshly school. And you can see how that really triggers that Victorian sense of morality. So yes, that's what he meant by the fleshly school of poetry.
Well, awesome. I am absolutely thrilled that we were able to spend just some time exploring tradition and exploring the roots and kind of where Gilbert and Sullivan come from an idea standpoint. Next week, Dr. Farron is going to be speaking to gender identity and the role of women in the Victorian era. So at this time, we'll have another lecture discussion, another opportunity just to dialogue about norms and not norms in the Victorian era. So I'm super excited about that. And if there are no more questions, I think we're about at the time limit that we set.
Okay.
Bo, I appreciate you so much. Thank you, Dr. Rollins. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank y'all. Thank you for hosting.
There's more to come. More to come in relation to our grant and interdisciplinary study.
Cool.
Yay. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon. See you soon.
Thanks to you both.
I hope that wasn't too abrupt of an end there.
No, it's fine.
I loved it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you.
I wanted a logistical question, and I apologize. I was having some issues getting on the meeting. I couldn't do it on my computer, so I'm on my cell phone. It's probably just a tech thing on my end. I